So I'm here to talk to you about whether mandatory non-financial regulation of companies in regard to reporting on corporate social responsibility or responsible business conduct or whatever we like to call it, corporate sustainability, which is the most recent sort of kid on the block in terms of these terms, whether this can actually drive corporate change. And actually, I must say, Jill, I enjoyed your presentation very much. I think we have a lot in common. Maybe I'm a little bit more cynical than you are, but maybe that's because I work more in human rights than I work on environment and climate change. So the point really that spurred my curiosity almost 10 years ago is whether such reporting actually can drive change. I do believe it can, but also whether the way it's often being implemented, rolled out by regulatory authorities or other organizations is actually effective in driving change. So very, very basically, the question is, as set out at the bottom of the slide, do we get more responsible business with this mandatory reporting, or do we just get more reports? The reports, especially if we print them, it's definitely not going to be very good for the trees, which means also not very good for the forests, and it's not going to be good for CO2. And just on a cynical point, because the Global Compact introduced a mandatory communication of progress reporting already in 2004 as a response to critique of the Global Compact as being simply blue-washing, blue for the UN flag, and their point was, well, there's no way that the around 10 people or however many or few they were at the time in the Global Compact office in New York would be able to actually monitor whether companies were actually walking their talk, right? So they might have policies, they might report on them, but were they actually doing what they said they were doing? So the UN Global Compact said, so we will leave it to civil society. We will leave it to students. We will leave it to journalists to go out to Nepal to check whether the cardamom is really produced without child labor, whether the granite that we get from mines in China is really produced within the number of working hours that is allowed by Chinese law, which, by the way, is more favorable to the worker than ILO standards, etc. I just have not seen any of that happening. And I work quite closely with NGOs and have been for many years. So it's like there seems to be something in there. There's an assumption that someone else is going to check, but it doesn't really seem to happen. And I recognize what you say about NGOs now stepping up, and I recognize also what you say about climate change. And if that is really going to drive, I think is really, really great. I have strong faith in the capacity of civil society to, along with media and others, to drive such change through reputational damage. So there's definitely a point in there. So my curiosity is just whether there is a connection or maybe a disconnect between what the law does and the way that companies act and think, right? So to me, what got me thinking about this was the Danish government introduced mandatory CSR reporting for corporate social responsibility with effect from the financial year 2009. The Danish government likes to pride itself for being the first country to do that. I think that's a little bit the Danish way of always wanting to be a world champion, because yes, the Danish government introduced something they referred to as CSR reporting, but if we look elsewhere, similar things had been introduced by other governments just without that name. The point was, however, that the Danish government in their objectives had something that was quite interesting from this perspective of actually driving change, and I'll get to that in a moment. The act also applied to both to the company, but the groups as well as subsidiaries, and actually a quite large number of companies. But Denmark, with being a small country with only about 5 million people, the expectation was that about 1,100 companies would be reporting. So you can imagine that's actually, even if they say that it's the largest companies in the country, but it's actually quite a number of, it's not just the really large ones, Lego and Maersk and what have you, there's also a lot of other companies. In addition to institutional investors and state-owned companies that that were also required to do that. What happened then was that in 2012, I think, Denmark held the EU presidency in the spring or first half of the year. And Denmark used this as an opportunity to propose that the EU should introduce mandatory CSR reporting based on the Danish model. Now, this had already been introduced by the EU's most recent communication, which is like a policy statement on CSR from 2011, in which the EU did away with the previous definition of CSR as being only voluntary, meaning that the EU opened up opportunities for itself to start regulating companies, even in a very soft way, requiring CSR reporting. The fact was then that I thought, okay, if one thing is that the Danish model may work or may not work for different reasons, but now it's more being rolled out across the EU. So with the, I have to say, and I think Andreas may agree with me on this one, but even here in Germany, German businesses seem to have a stake in the EU non-financial reporting directive, it actually not applying to very many companies. We are limited to around 5,000 companies. Originally, the idea was it should be a lot more, but while some civil society organizations think this is a great idea, some companies don't think it's a very great idea. Regardless of the benefits they can actually gain from this, as Jill was saying. There are certainly benefits that companies can gain from engaging with non-financial reporting. But then again, 5,000 companies is still a lot more than 1,100, so that makes it even more interesting for me, maybe for others, to think, is this actually working? We can also look at the Dodd-Frank conflict minerals transparency reporting that Jill was also referring to. And I find that this issue about the US approach to reporting comes up quite often. I've also looked at it, and I find that yes, in the environmental and in the climate change field, it seems to actually be more effective. But if we look at the results of the Dodd-Frank conflict minerals reporting, indications are it's not really changing a whole lot. If we really want not less conflict minerals because they can just be gotten from other places, we really want less conflict in the Great Lakes region in Eastern Congo, is not really working, right? So are there other places to get these minerals? So what does this Danish mandatory reporting clause say? I will be looking here only at the original version, so not the way it was changed after the EU directive meant that the Danish government also had to change its original provision. So originally, these non-financial reports had to state policies, whether the company had any policies for social responsibility, including in standards, guidelines, or principles used. So this was, the last part was recognizing there's like an alphabet soup of CSR instruments. We have SA 8000, we have the UN Global Compact, we have GRI, we have the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. We now also have a reporting framework for the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. We just have a lot. So they could use different standards, guidelines, and principles. Then they had to say how these policies were turned into action, and finally what results had been achieved and expected in the future. Then in 2012, the Act was revised. Originally, companies had discretion in regard to the 5 CSR issue areas that they could report on, which were defined by the Act to be CSR, so human rights, labor rights, environment, anti-corruption, and climate change. Now, those of you familiar with the Global Compact will say, hey, did we hear about this before? Yes, indeed, you did. These are the 4 Global Compact issue areas and the caring for climate mandate also. One other thing about the climate was, of course, that Denmark, as you may remember, Denmark hosted the Climate Change Summit in 2009. Was a catastrophe, more or less. But at the time when the Danish government introduced this action plan that led to this act and introduced the act, the Danish government still thought they were going to do great things with the COP15. They didn't. So in 2012, the Act was changed so that now companies had to, it was mandatory for companies with policies on human rights or on climate change to report on these matters. Now, why was this? This is very interesting, actually, because for human rights, we had hardly any reports at all. For climate change, we had lots of reports, but we also had a government that said climate change. This is our thing. We want to have more of that, right? So it's interesting to observe that whereas human rights is a really strong Danish policy objective, especially in regard to international activities, transnational activities of Danish companies, and they had done hardly anything. Okay, so now it went from discretion in regard to picking your own subject or subjects to being mandated reporting. Not that the results have been really different. So in terms of the theoretical aspects, of course, this, in order to find out whether CSR reporting is really driving change, we need to combine a number of disciplines. And also, Jill was indicating this also, it's not enough to just take the legal perspective. You need to include organizational scholarship to recognize that CSR is not just voluntary, but also to think about what's actually driving change in corporations. So we need to go from the conventional black letter accountability approach to law to a more social legal approach, looking at law as a way to drive change, instrumental regulation. We need to consider how this connects with the organizational learning. And given that the business and human rights regime that emerged since the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council in 2008 adopted the so-called UN framework developed by Professor John Ruggie from Harvard, but not in his Harvard capacity, because he was asked by the Secretary General of the UN to do this. So the people who refer to this like the Ruggie framework or Ruggie principles, actually I would say get it wrong, because these are the UN framework and UN guiding principles. There's a huge difference between somebody taking on a personal task as an academic, any one of us can do that, and then being asked by the UN Secretary General to try to deliver a solution to something that had been blocked so far due to political reasons. But anyway, the business and human rights have really been driving this. So where does this take us? If we look at the legislative history of the Danish Act, and the legislative history is very much part of the Scandinavian legal method. If you want to understand what does a law want to do, it's recognized, at least among lawyers, that you look at the legislative history. Now, unfortunately, this is not well known to people without a legal background. So many of my colleagues at Copenhagen Business School with an organizational background who have been looking at this, they only read the law. And of course, business managers do the same thing. Now, in the Scandinavian and the Danish tradition, a law is really, really brief. But if you look at the legislative history, then it becomes much more expansive. You understand what it's about. So if you just read the law, you think this is just about compliance, right? You've been taught, if you're not a lawyer, you've been taught law is about black letter law, it's about doing what the law says, that's all. It's probably just an administrative burden, let's get it over with and done so we can get on with making business. But if you read the legislative history, you will see that the government had a really, really strong objective of really stimulate the uptake with Danish firms of social needs and expectations in their corporate strategies and activities. So there was this change of this objective of organizational change. In particularly, there was a very strongly expressed objective that Danish companies, in regard to their supply chain, would do much more to make sure that the supply chains observe labor rights and human rights. And why is this? This is because, of course, the Danish government cannot regulate outside of Denmark. So when Danish companies, which are very often have transnational activities, source textiles from Bangladesh or coal from Colombia, whatever, it is the Danish government has these policy objectives, which the EU shares, of promoting labor rights and human rights elsewhere, outside of Denmark, outside of the EU. What can they do? They can just call up companies to do something voluntarily, right? So this was really an important thing. They also wanted to encourage more Danish firms to join the UN Global Compact for political reasons, and then they thought, how can we do that? Well, we'll just say that companies that are members of the Global Compact and of course have to submit the UN Global Compact Communication and Progress Report, they don't have to also submit a Danish report. So the UN Global Compact report would double. Now what we see is there was a surge in Danish companies joining the Global Compact between 2008 and 2010. For marketing reasons also. This is a good selling point if you want to say you're socially responsible. So you know what's in this for company law, corporate governance, and supply chain was precisely this connection between the economy and the and law. How law can change, how law can stimulate organizational change. Now, if we look at accounting scholarship, unfortunately, while some says that yes, reporting can drive certain changes, when we look at non-financial disclosure, I'm afraid that this only supports some of my cynicism, that unfortunately the accounting scholarship says that when companies are required to report on something that is not financial, then they tend to paint the picture that the society wants to see, which means they tend to share the information that is not problematic, whereas they don't share the information that might be problematic. So when the law introduces an auditing process that only audits whether the company actually complies with the law, so reports on its policies, reports on implementation, and reports on results, but doesn't go out and check whether this is actually also what they do in practice, then they will tend to just tell the nice things, right? Can be nicely audited. Now, if we look then at how might this instead stimulate organizational change, one of the very interesting theories, I think, is the reflexive law, legal law to poesis thinking, which corresponds very nicely also with some work by some of our organizational scholars that say that for reporting to drive organizational change, it has to be done very strategically by the company. So if the company says, this is just something we have to do, if they focus on the report, they're not going to get their resources worth, because they actually spend a lot of time and put in a lot of resources. They often have to even employ people to do the report. Right? So with this time they spend, the resources they spend, they should get their money's worth. The only way they can do that is by approaching reporting as a strategic learning exercise. To say, when we engage in this exercise, we are going to become better at doing business. We're going to reduce the risks that, say, reputational damage, naming and shaming, can cause us. How do we do that? We do that by understanding more about how society thinks about it, how what society expects us to do. And this is where the reflexive law, legal law to poesis comes into the picture. Because this is really the idea that for any organization any organization is a closed system, but it's also open to pressure, to irritation from society. So if you want to induce, stimulate change in any system like the economic system, so this is really requires you to think about not institutions the way we normally think, with legal institutions, economic, political institutions, but think about the function, right? The function defined by its binary code, something, and the opposite. So for companies, we think about profit or non-profit. This is really what keeps a company going. If it doesn't make profit, it will go out of business. It cannot do harm anymore, but it also will not do any more good. So if we want companies to change, we need to activate this logic. How can we activate this profit, non-profit logic? We can do that by companies understanding about expectations that society has of them that will really affect whether they make profit or not. Now that's where Jill's point on naming and shaming really comes in. Because yes, it does have an effect, and especially the role of investors. We like to think about the political consumer, but unfortunately consumers tend to shop with our wallets and not our hearts. But investors, they always have a choice. They can invest in another company that has a serious policy for how it impacts society. So when an investor says, hey, if you're not responsible, if your policy is not in place, if you don't have your risk-based due diligence in place, we are going to put our money in some other company, then they feel it, right? That's also why these Indonesian and the palm oil sector is actually, palm oil business in Indonesia is actually starting to change, because they're losing investors. So the point is for non-financial reporting to do this trick, it has to work in such a way that companies actually, through the reporting, engage with their stakeholders. This is precisely what the Danish CSR reporting requirement did initially, wanted to do initially. It was very clear when we look at the legislative objectives. This was the point. This was to stimulate companies into engaging with their stakeholders. Unfortunately, the way it's been presented to companies and the way it's been understood by the media and the way it's been understood by organizational scholars was more about simply complying with the law. So it hasn't driven much change yet. And from the studies that we have seen, actually, I think there's some pretty interesting findings that companies that were voluntarily, and I'm finishing now, voluntarily reporting before it became mandatory, they were much more actively, creatively thinking about how they could actually reduce their adverse impact on society, how they could work actively with their supply chains, how they could help their supply chains become better and at responsible business conduct, at observing labor law, at reducing greenhouse gases through training. But once it was mandatory to report, they just reported very narrowly on observing ILO core labor standards, very much to the point in regards to what's required also in terms of environment and climate change, greenhouse gas emissions. The creativity is not there anymore, right? It's all like, of course everyone says that they do what they have to do, but they don't do anything else. So the conclusions are here that, yes, there are definitely, the theory definitely supports the idea that non-financial reporting can stimulate change. But it is hugely important that it is communicated in a way that makes it clear to companies that this is actually for them to become better at doing business. This is not just a matter of publishing reports. It's also important to be realistic about what accountability can be driven by this ex-post approach by civil society actors. And I think also, especially if we look at human rights or labor rights, to be very realistic about whether ex-post accountability is really what we want. Yes, we want that too, but it's much better to prevent harm done. Right? So if we have an approach that is more like showing what you did after you did it, rather than stimulating corporations to really preventatively engage with the risks that they may cause to society, I don't think we're really going to get what we want out of this non-financial reporting, neither for companies nor for the rest of us. So thank you very much, and thanks for your patience.